The story begins in a quiet countryside estate where the silence after their father's funeral felt heavier than grief itself. The house that once held laughter and memories was now just walls filled with suspicion and unspoken tension. For Sarah, the eldest daughter, grief mixed with unease. Her father's death wasn't just the loss of a parent, it was the end of a long and painful chapter in a family ruled by favoritism. Her brother, Daniel, had always been the golden child. Charming, manipulative, and endlessly praised by their father, he could do no wrong. Sarah, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the one who stayed behind to care for their father in his last years while Daniel chased business ventures and social status. Their father's wealth was considerable, land, stocks, and a fortune built over decades of sacrifice. Sarah never cared about the money. What she wanted was acknowledgement, that her years of devotion, care, and sleepless nights by their father's bedside meant something. But deep down, she feared that even in death, her father would still choose Daniel. When the lawyer arrived that morning, everyone gathered in the study, the same room where their father used to read in silence. The air smelled of old wood and polished leather, but now it carried the weight of expectation. Daniel leaned back in his chair, confident, almost smug. He had that same lazy smile, the one that made people believe he already knew how things would turn out. Sarah sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The lawyer began reading the will, his voice calm but mechanical, the words slicing through the stillness of the room. The opening lines were formal, acknowledgments of family, memories, and legacies. Then came the moment of truth. The inheritance, everything, went to Daniel. Not a portion, not a share, not even a token left for Sarah. Every asset, every investment, the house itself, all of it was left solely in Daniel's name. The words felt like a knife. Sarah's heart pounded as her ears rang. The lawyer continued, explaining that the decision had been made years ago when their father believed Daniel was better suited to handle the family's finances. Sarah stared blankly, unable to move. Daniel didn't hide his smirk. He pretended to look surprised, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. To him, this wasn't loss or tragedy. It was a victory he had long anticipated. Sarah didn't cry. She simply sat still, her mind unraveling. All those nights she spent feeding their father, helping him walk, managing his medicine, all while Daniel never once visited, meant nothing. The man who had called her, his rock, in his final months had chosen her brother instead. After the reading, Daniel stood, patting her shoulder with mock sympathy before striding out of the room. His car engine roared moments later, fading down the road, leaving her behind. Again, days passed. The house no longer felt like home. Daniel returned a week later, not for sentiment, but to handle paperwork. He strutted through the halls like he already owned them, because legally he did. He told Sarah he'd take care of everything, and that she could stay for a few weeks until she figured out her next move. His tone was condescending, dripping with false generosity. Sarah quietly packed her bags. She left without a word, moving into a small apartment on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the estate's grandeur. She found work at a local art gallery, earning just enough to survive. Her father's portrait hung in her mind every night, the man who had trusted the wrong child. For months, Sarah tried to move on, but pain slowly transformed into something sharper. The betrayal festered inside her like a slow burning fire. She began noticing things. Whispers in the town about Daniel's behavior. The lavish spending, the risky investments, the parties at the mansion. He was burning through the inheritance faster than anyone thought possible. And that's when Sarah made her decision. She wouldn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she would watch, learn, wait for the moment he needed something from her. Because she knew Daniel's arrogance. She knew he believed himself invincible, but arrogance always breeds downfall, and she would be there when it came. Over the next year, Sarah observed from a distance. The mansion began to change, windows cracked. The garden grew wild. People whispered that Daniel was losing control. His friends stopped visiting. Creditors began showing up. One night, while leaving work, Sarah saw him, standing outside a local bar, disheveled, arguing with someone over money. It was the first time she'd seen him look small. In that moment, she realized her father's will might have been Daniel's curse, not his reward. And Sarah, the forgotten daughter, was ready to turn that curse into justice. The mysterious letter sat on Sarah's kitchen table for hours before she found the courage to touch it again. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. The paper felt old, almost brittle, and the signature, her father's, looked undeniably real. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her mind spinning through every possibility. If this document was true, then everything she had accepted as fate, her disinheritance, her suffering, might have been the result of deceit. She tried to remember every detail from that day at the lawyer's office, the way Daniel had looked so certain, the way the lawyer had avoided meeting her eyes. Something about it had felt rehearsed. Now it made sense. The will might have been tampered with, and her brother could have been behind it. Over the next few days, Sarah began quietly investigating. She visited the law firm that handled her father's estate, pretending to request old documents for personal records. The receptionist hesitated but eventually let her view copies. Everything appeared official. The papers were stamped, signed, and sealed. But something caught her attention. The notary's date was weeks after her father had been hospitalized during a time when he could barely hold a pen. Her heart pounded. The will was forged. She spent that night sleepless, sitting by her window, the letter beside her like a ghost whispering secrets. The betrayal was deeper than she had ever imagined. Her brother hadn't just stolen her inheritance. He had stolen her father's last wishes. The more she thought about it, the more she remembered small clues from before her father's death. Daniel's sudden visits after years of absence, his private conversations with their father behind closed doors, his insistence that he handle all the paperwork. Sarah had dismissed it as guilt or reconciliation, but now she knew better. He hadn't come home to make peace. He had come to secure his victory. Sarah's anger began to evolve into something deliberate. Revenge wasn't just about payback anymore. It was about justice. She decided to reach out to someone who might know more. An old family friend, Mr. Collins, had once worked as her father's financial advisor. She remembered him as a kind man who had always respected her, unlike Daniel's friends who only saw her as the quiet sister. When she met him at a cafe days later, he seemed uneasy but sympathetic. As she mentioned the will, his expression changed. He admitted that her father had confided in him before his death. He intended to split the inheritance equally between his two children. Collins had even drafted a preliminary version of that will. But before it could be finalized, Daniel had intervened, bringing in a new lawyer, claiming their father wanted to simplify things. Sarah's suspicions were now a grim certainty. Her father's trust had been manipulated. Mr. Collins handed her an old folder he had kept. Copies of financial transfers, early drafts of estate documents, even handwritten notes from her father. Each note mentioned Sarah with warmth and gratitude. One line in particular broke her heart. Sarah deserves more than money. She deserves peace. She felt tears burn her eyes, but alongside the pain was a sharp clarity. Daniel had erased not only her inheritance, but her father's final act of love. Now she knew what she had to do. She couldn't simply expose Daniel, not yet. She needed to break him the way he had broken her, slowly, deliberately, and with precision. She started small. Through careful online searches and a few quiet phone calls, she discovered Daniel's finances were in ruins. He had mortgaged the family house twice, taken out loans under shell companies, and was drowning in gambling debt. His arrogance had blinded him, and he was desperate for a bailout. Sarah began reaching out anonymously to people Daniel owed money to, creditors, investors, and business partners. She shared subtle pieces of information, just enough to make them question his reliability. Rumors spread quickly, and his reputation started to crumble. Within weeks, Daniel's social circle began to shrink. The same people who used to praise him now avoided him. His name, once associated with charm and success, became a warning. Sarah watched quietly, never revealing her hand. But her revenge was far from complete. She wanted Daniel to feel the loss, not just financially, but emotionally. She wanted him to experience what it was like to be powerless. She began visiting the family estate under the pretense of retrieving personal items. Daniel didn't object. He barely had time to notice. He was too busy trying to salvage his collapsing life. Each time she visited, she took small but meaningful things. Family photos, heirlooms, her father's old journals. She wasn't stealing. She was reclaiming what had always been hers. One day, while sorting through her father's belongings in the old study, she found a hidden drawer beneath the desk. Inside was a USB drive labeled Pi Vite. Her hands trembled as she plugged it into her laptop. The drive contained audio files, recordings of her father's voice. The last file stopped her breath. It was dated 2 weeks before his death. Her father's weakened voice spoke slowly, explaining that he had changed his mind about the will. He wanted Sarah to inherit the estate because she had proven her loyalty and love. He had recorded the message as proof, just in case something happened to him or the documents were altered. It was undeniable evidence. Sarah leaned back, tears rolling silently down her face. For the first time in years, she felt seen, vindicated. Her father hadn't abandoned her. Daniel had robbed them both. As she stared at the computer screen, a thought formed, dark but inevitable. She could expose Daniel immediately. The recordings, the drafts, the forgery, it was all there. But that would be too merciful. He needed to understand the weight of betrayal, the desperation of losing everything he thought he owned. She would use his own greed against him. Sarah smiled faintly for the first time in months. The real game was about to begin. When Sarah met Daniel again, years of suppressed anger churned beneath her calm exterior. He arrived at the cafe looking nothing like the confident man she remembered. His tailored suits replaced by wrinkled shirts, his eyes sunken, his expression haunted. Though Sarah said nothing, she could tell he was desperate. The once arrogant brother who had gloated over her misfortune now looked like a man standing on the edge of ruin. As he spoke about his temporary setbacks, Sarah listened quietly, nodding at the right moments. Every word he said confirmed what she already knew. His business had collapsed, his debts were closing in, and the friends who once praised him had turned their backs. He was seeking help, financial or otherwise, from the one person he believed still pitied him. Inside, Sarah's emotions twisted between satisfaction and sadness. She remembered their childhood, how Daniel had always been favored, how he had taken the best of everything. Their father's attention, the opportunities, even the praise that should have been shared. But this time, things were different. For the first time in their lives, she had the power, and Daniel didn't even realize it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began calling her more often. At first, he masked his intentions with casual talk, but soon his true purpose became clear. He wanted money. His desperation grew more obvious with each passing day, and Sarah could feel him unraveling. It was exactly what she wanted. But instead of rejecting him, she played along. She told him she might know someone willing to invest in his failing ventures, someone who trusted her judgment. Daniel's tone changed immediately. He became polite, deferential, even flattering. He had no idea that the vesture was a lie, a test of his humility and greed. Behind the scenes, Sarah continued gathering evidence. She hired a forensic expert to verify the authenticity of the audio recordings from the USB drive. The results came back conclusive. The voice was genuine. The timestamps aligned perfectly with her father's final weeks, and the message clearly contradicted the will on record. It was proof of forgery, enough to destroy Daniel legally. But Sarah didn't go to the police, not yet. She wanted Daniel to crawl first. She wanted him to beg. One evening, she orchestrated a meeting between Daniel and her fabricated investor, using a trusted friend to play the role. The friend, a sharp businesswoman named Emily, met Daniel under the guise of considering a large financial deal. Daniel, desperate and naive, poured out every lie he could think of. Exaggerated numbers, false projections, inflated property values. Emily recorded everything. The next day, Sarah listened to the recording, shaking her head as Daniel's voice filled the room, confident, deceitful, manipulative. The same tone he'd once used to steal their father's inheritance. But now, it was all coming back to him. A week later, Daniel called again. His tone panicked. The creditors had frozen his accounts. Rumors about his fraudulent dealings were spreading, and investors were pulling out. His empire, built on lies and stolen trust, was collapsing faster than he could control. Sarah remained calm, even kind, offering words of false comfort. She wanted him to come to her, to see her as his last hope. It didn't take long. On a stormy evening, Daniel showed up at her apartment door. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, his once proud demeanor gone. He admitted that everything was falling apart. He needed money, urgently, or he'd lose everything. Sarah studied him silently, hiding the satisfaction in her heart. The man who had taken everything from her now stood before her, broken and pleading. She asked what had happened, pretending to be shocked. He spoke in fragments, blaming the economy, bad luck, and unfair rumors. But Sarah knew the truth. He was finally reaping what he had sown. She told him she might be able to help, but it would take time. Daniel accepted without hesitation. He didn't care what she had to do, he only cared about saving himself. That night, as he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet apartment, the city lights reflecting through her window. She opened her laptop and began drafting an anonymous email, addressed to a local journalist known for exposing white-collar corruption. Attached were documents, recordings, and the truth about Daniel's forged will. But she didn't send it, not yet. The time wasn't right. She wanted Daniel to feel the walls closing in before she delivered the final blow. In the following days, Daniel's situation worsened. His house went into foreclosure. The bank froze his assets, his car was repossessed. Every symbol of wealth and status he had used to belittle her was being stripped away. Then came the call Sarah had been waiting for. Daniel, his voice shaking, admitted that he was out of options. He asked if he could stay with her, just for a while. Sarah hesitated, feigning surprise, but inside, she smiled coldly. The man who had thrown her out of their family home was now asking for a place to sleep. It was poetic justice. She agreed, pretending to be sympathetic. When he moved in, she noticed how humbled he seemed. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by quiet shame. But she also knew his pride hadn't fully died. Not yet. He still believed he could rebuild. For now, she let him believe it. Every day, she watched him struggle, applying for jobs that never called back, avoiding creditors, drowning in regret. And every night, she sat quietly, listening to the secret recordings of her father's voice, reminding herself why she was doing this. Her father had trusted Daniel, loved him despite his flaws, and Daniel had betrayed that love. Now Sarah would teach him what betrayal felt like. Weeks passed, and Daniel began breaking under the pressure. He grew distant, paranoid, and restless. Sometimes Sarah would hear him crying in his room at night. Other times he would stare blankly at old family photos, as if searching for forgiveness he no longer deserved. Then one morning, Sarah came home to find Daniel sitting at the table with a letter in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The letter was from the law firm that had handled their father's will. The authorities had begun investigating discrepancies in the estate documents. Someone had tipped them off. Sarah froze. She hadn't sent the evidence yet, which meant someone else had. Her heart pounded as she realized that her quiet war might no longer be hers alone. Sarah's chest tightened as Daniel's words echoed in the room. Someone had turned the story upside down. She could see it in his trembling hands, the fear in his eyes. Not just fear of losing money or reputation this time, but fear of losing everything. He handed her the letter. The name at the bottom chilled her. An attorney from the same law firm that had once handled their father's estate. It stated that new allegations had been brought forward, claims that Sarah had manipulated documents and orchestrated financial sabotage against her brother for personal revenge. The irony cut deep. Daniel, the thief of her inheritance, now appeared to be the victim, and someone out there wanted to make sure it looked that way. Sarah's mind raced. She had been careful. Every file, every email, every trace of her investigation had been anonymous. Or so she thought. The possibility that someone had discovered her secret plan was terrifying. But even worse was the suspicion forming in her mind this wasn't random. Someone wanted her destroyed just as she was about to win. Daniel watched her closely, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He asked her if she knew anything about it, his voice shaking. Sarah kept her expression steady, pretending confusion, though inside her thoughts spun like a storm. That night, after Daniel retreated to the guest room, Sarah sat in the dark living room replaying everything in her head. Every person she'd contacted, every file she'd moved. She thought of Mr. Collins, the old advisor who had helped her uncover the truth. He was the only one who knew the full story. Could he have betrayed her? The next morning, she decided to find out. She drove across town to Collins's quiet suburban house. The garden, once neatly trimmed, was overgrown. When he opened the door, she saw a man haunted by guilt. He seemed older, thinner. His eyes darted nervously as she mentioned the investigation. He hesitated, then finally confessed. Someone had approached him, offering money in exchange for information about Sarah's actions. He hadn't said yes immediately, but fear had driven him. The man who'd approached him was Daniel's former business partner, a ruthless investor named Richard Hale, a man known for using blackmail and manipulation to destroy competitors. Hale had apparently learned about Daniel's forged will years ago, but had chosen to stay silent, using that knowledge to control him. Now, seeing Daniel's empire crumble, Hale had turned his focus to Sarah, a new pawn in his game. Sarah felt sick. The trap was deeper than she'd imagined. If Richard had real evidence against her, or worse, access to the same recordings she held, he could twist the truth completely. He could make her look like the manipulator, the liar, the one rewriting family history for revenge. As she drove home, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then heavy, soaking the streets in silver light. The house felt colder than ever when she entered. Daniel was in the kitchen, hunched over his phone, whispering to someone. When he noticed her, he quickly ended the call. Something had changed between them. The fragile truce they shared was cracking. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept hearing her father's voice in her mind, the recordings from the USB, his words of love and trust. He had believed in her, and she couldn't let his legacy be rewritten by liars. She opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. Her evidence, her father's words, and the proof of Daniel's forgery. But as she was writing, she heard the creak of footsteps outside her door. She froze. The handle turned slowly. Daniel stood there in the dim light, his face pale and tired. He said he couldn't sleep, that everything was spinning out of control. He asked if she believed someone was trying to destroy them both. Sarah studied him. His words sounded genuine, but she couldn't tell if it was fear or deceit. She told him they needed to be careful, that someone was using them against each other. The next day, Daniel disappeared. His phone went straight to voicemail. Hours passed and Sarah's worry turned to dread. She drove to his old office, but it was empty. Then, late in the evening, she received a message. It was from an unknown number. Attached was a photo of Daniel, sitting in what looked like a dimly lit warehouse, his hands tied, his face bruised. A single line followed beneath the image. "You want the truth. Bring what's yours." Sarah's breath caught. They wanted the USB drive, her father's recordings. Richard Hale had made his move. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she knew it wouldn't work. Hale's power stretched too far, and any official involvement might bury the truth permanently. She had to handle this herself. She packed the USB, tucked it in her coat, and drove toward the address included in the message, an abandoned dockyard on the outskirts of the city. Rain lashed against the windshield as thunder rolled across the night sky. When she arrived, the air smelled of rust and salt. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the light inside flickering faintly. She stepped inside, her shoes echoing on the wet floor. There, in the middle of the room, sat Daniel, battered but alive. Across from him stood Richard Hale, tall, calm, and smiling. He spoke softly, though Sarah could barely hear over the pounding rain. He gestured toward her pocket, demanding the drive. Sarah hesitated. She realized suddenly that this wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about power, control, and truth. Hale didn't care about money. He wanted to rewrite the story to serve his own interests. If she handed over the drive, her father's final words would be erased. If she refused, Daniel might not survive the night. Her heart pounded as she took a slow step forward, pretending to reach for the USB. But as Hale moved closer, something shifted in her mind. She remembered her father's voice saying, "Sarah deserves peace." Peace wasn't found in fear. It was taken back. She reached for the drive, and then hurled it into the dark corner of the warehouse. It landed with a sharp metallic clang. Hale cursed, turning his attention away from her. In that brief moment, Sarah grabbed a nearby iron bar and swung it at the chain holding Daniel's chair. The bar snapped the lock loose, and Daniel stumbled free. But before they could escape, Hale lunged forward, tackling Sarah to the ground. The struggle was short and violent, the sound of shattering glass, the smell of oil and blood. Then, suddenly, Hale went still. He fell backward, striking his head against a metal beam. For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the rain and Daniel's ragged breathing. Sarah stood, shaking. Hale wasn't dead, but he was unconscious. Daniel, trembling, looked at her in disbelief. The USB drive still glimmered faintly in the shadows. Sarah picked it up, clutching it tight. She had saved her brother, but also risked everything. The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-soaked warehouse walls as sirens grew louder. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood frozen beside her trembling brother. The metallic scent of blood hung in the air, mixing with oil and salt. Hale's body lay motionless on the concrete floor, his breathing shallow but alive. Daniel's words still echoed in her ears. "They're coming for us." Somehow, someone had called the police, but not to report a kidnapping. It was something else. Sarah didn't know how, but it felt like the trap had been reset. this time with both of them caught inside. They had only seconds to decide. If they stayed, they'd be arrested. And with Hale's influence, the story would be twisted to make them look guilty. If they ran, it would confirm their guilt in the eyes of the law. Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him toward the back exit. The rain hit them hard as they stumbled into the alley behind the warehouse, their clothes soaked and their breaths sharp and uneven. They fled into the night, headlights flashing across puddles as police cars surrounded the area. Somehow, they managed to slip away through a side street, disappearing into the storm. They spent the rest of the night hiding in Sarah's car near the edge of town. Daniel sat silently, his face pale and drawn, while Sarah stared out the window, her mind spinning. Every decision she had made, every step of her revenge, had led them here. And now the lines between justice and destruction had blurred beyond recognition. At dawn, Daniel finally spoke. He told her that Hale had been blackmailing him for years, holding evidence of his forged will as leverage. Hale had made him sign false documents, launder money, and even lie in court. Everything Daniel had done, the inheritance theft, the manipulation, had been the start of a chain that Hale controlled. Sarah felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest. For so long she had seen Daniel as the sole villain, the greedy brother who stole her future. But now she saw a man who had also been trapped, consumed by his own cowardice and guilt. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't free either. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't run anymore. She couldn't let her father's legacy end in lies. She would bring the truth to light, even if it destroyed them both. Sarah drove them back to her apartment, exhausted and soaked. The USB drive was still in her pocket, her father's voice echoing faintly in her memory. It was her only weapon, proof not just of Daniel's crime, but of Hale's manipulation and the corruption that had consumed their family's legacy. She turned on her laptop and began assembling everything. The recordings, the forged documents, the timeline of events. Daniel watched silently, his guilt written all over his face. She included everything, even her own actions, her lies, her manipulations. If this was going to end, it would end in truth. But before she could finish, there was a knock at the door. Her heart froze. Daniel looked through the peephole and stiffened. 2 detectives stood outside. They weren't from the local precinct. They were from the state division, the same one that had investigated Hale's business empire. Sarah realized it was over. They opened the door. The detectives asked to come in, their tone calm but authoritative. They said Hale was in critical condition and that both she and Daniel were persons of interest. Sarah didn't resist. She knew running would only make things worse. She handed over the USB drive, explaining that it contained her father's last words, proof that the will had been forged. The detectives exchanged a look, unsure of what to believe. They took the drive, promising to analyze it. Sarah and Daniel were separated during questioning. For hours, she sat in a sterile room, her hands clasped tightly together. The questions came in waves, about the will, the money, Hale's injuries, and her involvement in Daniel's downfall. She told the truth, all of it. The manipulation, the betrayal, the revenge. The detectives listened in silence. When she finished, one of them leaned back, studying her with a strange expression. He said something that stayed with her long after she left the station. Justice isn't always clean, Miss Turner. But it has a way of finding the truth, even through the dirt. They released her that night, but Daniel wasn't so lucky. He had confessed too much, the forgery, the fraud, the deals with Hale. His arrest was inevitable. When Sarah returned home, the apartment felt emptier than ever. The silence pressed against her chest. She walked through each room, remembering every choice she had made. The revenge, the lies, the satisfaction that had turned to pain. A few days later, she received a call from the detectives. The recordings from the USB had been verified. Her father's voice was authentic. The will on file had been confirmed as a forgery orchestrated by Daniel under Hale's direction. The truth was finally out. The media storm that followed was relentless. Headlines painted Daniel as both a criminal and a victim of Hale's schemes. Hale's name, too, was dragged through the mud, his empire exposed for years of corruption. Sarah's name appeared briefly in the reports, the estranged sister who exposed the truth, but she felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Weeks later, she visited her father's grave for the first time in years. The air was still, the sky soft with pale light. She knelt beside the gravestone and placed her hand against the cold marble. She whispered her apology, Not for seeking revenge, but for losing herself in it. For letting anger define her for so long. As she stood to leave, she noticed a folded note tucked between the flowers someone had left earlier. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words froze her in place. "You did well, Sarah, but some debts never die." There was no signature. Her pulse quickened. She looked around the cemetery, but no one was there. The glow of the computer screen painted Sarah's face in cold light as her father's voice filled the room. It was calm, steady, and hauntingly familiar. But this message was different. It wasn't a farewell. It was a confession. Her heart pounded as she leaned closer, trembling fingers brushing the keyboard. The timestamp on the recording was from a month before her father's death. After his supposed stroke, after the family believed he could no longer speak clearly. "If you're hearing this, my child," his voice said, "then you've uncovered part of the story. But not all of it. I know you, Sarah. You won't stop until you find the truth. So I must tell you what truly happened to our family and why I changed my will before they forced my hand." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her father's voice continued, explaining how Hale had come into their lives years ago, offering to expand the family business after Daniel's reckless investments failed. At first, he seemed like a savior, promising stability and profit. But over time, he grew controlling, manipulative, using Daniel's greed and insecurities as tools. Then came the betrayal. Hale had forged partnerships, siphoned money from company accounts, and slowly turned Daniel against his own father. When their father confronted him, Hale threatened to expose Daniel's crimes. The forgeries, the secret loans, the debts. The shame would have destroyed the family's reputation forever. "So I made a decision," the voice said, heavy with sorrow. "I drafted a new will. I planned to leave everything to you, Sarah. Not because you were perfect, but because you were kind. You were the only one who still saw family as something worth protecting. But before I could sign it, Hale found out. The night before my collapse, I was poisoned." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Her pulse raced. Poisoned. Her father's voice cracked slightly in the recording. "I survived long enough to leave these recordings. I knew Daniel was lost in Hale's grip, but I believed one day you would return and you would finish what I couldn't." A tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Everything, the lies, the manipulation, the chaos, had been part of something far darker than she ever imagined. Her revenge had brought the truth to light, but now she realized she had only uncovered part of it. The recording ended with a final message: "Forgive your brother if you can, but never forgive the man who made him this way." Then the screen went black. Sarah sat frozen, her mind spiraling. Hale had survived the warehouse. She knew that from the detectives. If what her father said was true, then he had tried to kill her father to control the will. And now, with Daniel in custody, Hale was still free. Her phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just a number she didn't recognize. "You want answers? Come alone. The old estate. Midnight." The address was the same one where her father had lived. The house she'd sworn never to return to. Sarah hesitated, fear and determination battling inside her. But something deeper pushed her forward. The need for closure, for truth, for peace. She slipped the USB drive into her pocket, grabbed her coat, and left. The night was cold and silent as she drove down the winding road toward the estate. The mansion stood dark and abandoned, its windows reflecting the moonlight like hollow eyes. The front gate was open. Inside, dust hung in the air, and the faint scent of decay clung to every surface. Her footsteps echoed down the empty hallways, leading her toward her father's old study, the heart of the house, where every secret had once lived. The door creaked open. Hale sat behind the desk, pale and frail, his right arm in a sling. His face was thinner, his arrogance dulled by weeks of pain and exposure. He smiled weakly. "You came." Sarah said nothing, only watched him with cold, quiet fury. He began to speak, explaining how he had tried to control everything, how he had wanted her father's company and wealth, how he had underestimated her. He claimed he hadn't meant to poison anyone, that it was all a mistake, an accident of greed and fear. But Sarah could see through him. She didn't need words. His eyes said everything. When he finished, she placed the USB drive on the desk. It contained the full confession, her father's voice, the proof of the poisoning, the timeline of Hale's crimes. She told him it was already sent to the authorities, and copies were scheduled to go public at dawn. There was no more bargaining, no more threats. For the first time, Hale's composure broke. His voice shook as he begged her to reconsider, to make a deal, to let him disappear quietly. But Sarah turned away. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had justice. By morning, news broke across the city. Hale was arrested in his estate, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. The recordings were played in court, and the truth finally came to light. Daniel's sentence was reduced after evidence proved Hale's manipulation and coercion. Months later, the inheritance was restored. But Sarah refused it. She sold her share of the company, donating most of it to charities her father once supported. What she kept, she used to rebuild her life, quietly, peacefully, without the shadows of greed or guilt. She never saw Daniel again, though sometimes she wondered how he was, if he'd found peace, or if he was still haunted by the ghosts of their past. On the anniversary of her father's death, Sarah returned to the estate one last time. The house was silent, stripped of furniture, waiting to be demolished. In the study, sunlight spilled across the desk where it had all begun. She placed a single photograph there, of her, her father, and Daniel from years ago, before greed had torn them apart. Then she whispered a final goodbye and walked away. As she reached the gate, a soft wind blew through the trees, carrying the faintest sound. A voice, warm and gentle, like her father's whisper. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. You found the truth." She smiled through her tears. For the first time in years, she felt free. The story had ended not in vengeance, but in peace.